I am delighted to be doing this presentation today. It's always, it's a particular pleasure to work with the FSHD Society and with the folks that we've met in the FSHD community. We're really excited about the drug development program that we're working on for FSHD, and we are moving it forward as fast as we can. So I want to talk a little bit today about a perspective on how industry and advocacy and the patient community can work together to help accelerate these therapies and make sure that the right compound and the right program gets to the clinic. But what I'm really interested in is just to give you my brief insights and then hear what you all have to say and get your questions and comments back, because I think that's where the most interesting information sharing will happen. So I will take you through a short presentation. You probably recognize the gentleman on my opening slide here. That's Howard Chapner, your FSHD Society board member and a fellow San Franciscan of ours. I live in San Francisco and work in Boston and go back and forth. And I actually went and visited Howard and his wife in San Francisco. He is a superb human being, and I now consider him a friend as well as a colleague in this effort. I want to just make sure you know that we have some forward-looking statements now. As a public company, we went public in October or September, excuse me. And so we have a few forward-looking statements that you should know about. Happy to share those after the meeting if you're interested in them. And then just to jump into our presentation here. So Dyne is a 2-year-old biotech company. We're based in Boston, as I mentioned. Our mission is bringing life-transforming therapies to people with serious muscle diseases. And I think it's an important point to make because we're not a platform company. We're not about developing therapies for diseases that fit within our particular modality. We're really focused on serious muscle diseases. And FSHD is one of the lead 3 indications that we're targeting. We're all in for serious muscle. The technology that we have developed is, I think, really exciting. I worked with over 45 companies when I was at the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation. And as you all know, myotonic dystrophy and FSHD have some similarities. They're adult onset, primarily adult onset muscle diseases, muscle wasting diseases. And I talked to a lot of different companies that were interested in developing potential therapies. And I got particularly excited about Dyne because we, I should say at this point, have what we believe is a strategy to solve the delivery problem for antisense oligonucleotides. So the FORCE platform is an antisense oligonucleotide, which is a compound or a molecule that has been demonstrated to be very effective in targeting muscle diseases. And in the FORCE platform, it is conjugated or linked to a very specific antibody. In the case of FSHD, we actually have an exclusive license with the University of Mons to access their best-in-class payload of antisense oligonucleotides, specifically targeting DUX4 expression in animal models, and we're really excited to bring those to the clinic with our conjugate to see how we can help improve the lives of people living with this disease. This is an overview of our FORCE platform. So as I mentioned, it's a conjugate. So you have the antibodies, which in this case would be the UMONS antibodies, or sorry, the antisense oligonucleotides down here in the little blue twists. And then you have a linker, which is a Valcit linker, which is this piece of the conjugate here. And then here you have a fragmented antibody, or a Fab. And the exciting thing about this proprietary Fab that we have developed is that it preferentially targets the TFR1 receptor on cells, and particularly muscle cells. So you have a delivery mechanism in this Fab that preferentially targets muscle and the TFR1 receptor on the outside of the muscle cell wall that allows the payload in. And because you have far fewer TFR1 receptors in liver and kidney and off-target organs and tissue, you have far more delivery of the payload to muscle cells and far less delivery to places where you don't want it, like the liver and the kidneys. We're pretty excited about this, and the nice thing about this platform is, in addition to being a really, what we believe will be a really compelling opportunity to deliver really important payload to muscle, it allows us to use different payload depending on the disease. So you can have cytoplasmic localization, you can have nuclear localization, and depending on the mutation that you're targeting, you can attach a different payload. So the FORCE platform is really our silver bullet, and we're super excited about the opportunity to bring it to FSHD. I would say the other thing about Dyne that has been exciting to me since before I even joined is our focus on the community of people that we're serving. And we have, in the year that, you know, we are a 2-year-old company, in the last year we've had a number of different patient events that have been focused on specific rare disease days and conferences and whatnot. And the idea has been to really make sure that the people in this company know who they're working for. So we actually, for World FSHD Day, we hosted a Zoom call with everyone in the company. And we actually ended up including 3 different families living with FSHD, Angela and Laszlo, and their 2 daughters, and Howard, and also Russell Caratanuto. And we had them talk about what it's like to live with the disease from their different perspectives. And then the company participants were allowed to ask questions and really dig a little deeper into understanding this disease from a very personal perspective. And what that does for us is it creates what the chairman of my old organization used to call emotional blackmail, which I think is really effective. So you have people working in this company now that have met and are attached to people living with FSHD. And when we talk about developing therapies, we talk about developing therapies for Angelo and Laszlo and their daughters. And we talk about developing therapies for Howard. And we want to hurry things up for Howard and Russell. We want to make sure that we can get something to them so that there's very little progression and we can hopefully reverse their symptoms. So it becomes a much more personal, compelling drug development opportunity, and it makes it a more compelling job for people that work at Dyne, and it also makes it more urgent. So we have done these different programs over the course of the year, and we'll continue to do them next year. We'll also be launching quarterly communications opportunities to make sure that we're reporting back to communities like the FSHD community and making sure that when you all want to know what's going on with the program, as much as we can share that information, we'll be sharing it. So thinking about this question of advocacy and industry partnerships and getting to therapy sooner, I think the overarching message here is that you can't develop a therapy effectively and successfully and get it to the clinic if you're not involving people that are living with it from the get-go. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is you simply do not understand the disease unless you're talking to the community about it. And you cannot get a real understanding of disease burden. You can't really understand what is going to be the most important potential outcome measures and impacts of a potential therapy from reading the literature. You really have to be working with the community to understand the disease and understand the best way to target it and understand what a compelling outcome is really going to look like. You also really need to work with the community if you're going to understand what the design of a trial should look like. What is going to be too burdensome? What's an appropriate length for a clinical visit? How many clinical visits are appropriate? What kind of dosing is effective? When are you dosing too often? When is the strategy too burdensome for someone that's living with this disease? And those kinds of considerations are incredibly important because the way people actually operate once they get to the clinic and are involved in a clinic visit can have a huge impact on how the drug actually works and whether or not you see change in the outcome measures that you've selected. And that's incredibly critical when you have a slow progressing disease like FSHD. So there's a number of reasons why getting people that are living with these diseases involved as soon as possible and making sure that you work with them all the way through is incredibly important. So when I think about patient groups, for instance, working with a top-notch organization like the FSHD Society or Friends of FSH Research or AMI FSHD, it allows you to really connect with people living with these diseases in a way that is authentic and transparent and thoughtful. It allows you to work across different organizations and have a single voice around what the burden looks like, what's an appropriate trial design, et cetera, so that you don't have a lot of fragmentation in terms of the feedback that you're getting. Patient communities can also do a lot of work around longitudinal studies and registries. It's incredibly important when you're working in a disease like this that you have access to really good peer-reviewed data that's been published. And the only way to go to the FDA with a potential trial design and a drug strategy is to be able to cite published data that's been peer-reviewed that they will accept. If that data is not out there, it's much harder to get a clinical trial design approved by the FDA and to get a drug approved by the FDA. So when we talk about longitudinal studies like the RESOLVE study that FSHD Society is involved in and that DINE has helped fund, that's an incredibly pivotal study to develop the kind of data that we need to take to FDA and to also make sure that we really do understand progression in this disease and which endpoints and outcome measures for a trial are going to be the most effective. In the same way, when we think about designing a clinical trial and deciding where to cite it, looking at registries and understanding where people living with this disease are living, where people are more engaged, where people are signing up for registries and sharing information and are making themselves available, that's very important information too. So I always encourage people that want to be part of the solution in these drug development programs to make sure that you're signed up for the registries in your area, in your region, make sure that you know about the studies that are going on, and to the extent that you can participate in those studies, you get involved, and that you support organizations like the FSHD Society because they're the ones that we can partner with to reach you and to communicate with you and to make sure that we're moving forward. Again, I mentioned this notion of understanding disease burden. It's impossible to understand disease burden, to understand the unmet need, to understand what meaningful benefit looks like unless you're working with the community itself and with the organizations that represent the community. And then, you know, we can also work with organizations like the FSHD Society to create visibility and make sure that we're reaching out and you guys are hearing from us. We often get requests to have people from the community added to our mailing lists. And we don't really have mailing lists per se because we work with teams like the FSHD Society to do these communications efforts, to let you know when we have trials coming up, to let you know how the drug development program is going, and to communicate. So to the extent that we can partner with someone like the FSHD Society to build visibility around the work that we're doing, it's a huge benefit to us. So I have to say, patient groups, advocacy groups, and patient communities are just incredibly critical to the work that we do here at DINE, and we can't move these programs forward without this kind of partnership. I should say that June and Jamshid, the CSO at FSHD Society, and I were on the phone just yesterday talking about questions I had about site location and trial design and so forth, and we'll be meeting again next week as well. These communications are ongoing, and they're pivotal to helping us be successful as we move forward. When I think about, you know, what can we bring to the table, obviously from the industry's perspective, we bring therapies. So we will be developing an FSHD therapy. We will have 3 investigational new drug applications filed with the FDA between the fourth quarter of this year and the fourth quarter of next year. So we'll be bringing three different therapies for 3 different diseases forward. I can't unfortunately tell you the order of those, but it does tell you something about when we'll be in the clinic with the FSHD program. We can also bring resources. So we can bring sponsorships for different advocacy organization events. We can bring program support for specific programs. We can bring research funding and event participation. And what we really want to do is just be really solid long-term partners. And I know from being on the other side of the table when I was at the MVF, these kinds of partnerships really help us bridge between what the community of people living with these diseases wants to know and what industry is really up to. So it's important for us to be able to have these kinds of partnerships to make sure that you guys know what we're doing. And then I think we can also provide data. So we do a ton of disease studies and discovery. We have publications that we're putting out this year and next year. We develop research tools. We've actually developed our own animal models and our own assays and so forth, and cell lines and whatnot, to make sure that we're able to study the potential molecule that we're bringing forward effectively. And we also can create databases, and many industry members actually have created databases for either the patient community or some of the other data that's collected. So I think from the industry perspective, in addition to obviously the most important work that we do, which is bringing potential therapies forward, we also can significantly add to the foundation and the capacity and the space through the contribution of sponsorships, program support, research funding, disease discovery, publications, and research tools. And I think that working together, that's how we start to accelerate these therapy programs. So in short, I think working together, industry and patient groups, we can drive resources, capacity, and impact more quickly. And what that does is get us to the clinic more quickly and hopefully out and into the market with a transformative therapy. So that is a really brief overview, I think, of how we think about the partnership between patient advocacy groups and through patient advocacy groups, the community itself, and industry to accelerate these programs. And hopefully that was fairly cogent, a fairly cogent overview. So June,
thank you,
questions or comments?
Yes, so if people have questions, please go ahead and start typing them into the Q&A little module there. I have some questions of my own, as always. I was wondering if that was a wonderful, really concise explanation of the important role that patient advocacy organizations have and how we partner with industry. I'm wondering if, looking at what you've learned about FSHD Society's past activities, both supporting research, building the building the community, and so on. Are there things that jump out at you where you think like, wow, I'm glad they did that? And I wanted to communicate that because those are our audience here. They make it possible. They make this happen through their support.
So I think the resolve study is incredibly important. We don't, in any of the diseases that we work on, we do not have enough data. We don't know enough about disease progression. We don't know enough about the disease subtypes. We don't know enough about some of the genetic modifiers. So, and we don't have enough information to really carefully pick the right outcome measures to show whether a therapy is working. And I think your community knows this, but 95% of drug trials fail. And they don't always fail because the drug didn't work. They fail because the clinical trial was not designed correctly, because there wasn't enough information to design it correctly. And, that is the most heartbreaking outcome of all. When you have and I have actually spoken to physical therapists that run a lot of the trials in many of the centers that we will be working with. And they'll tell you that they have worked on drug trials where they think the drug was working, and you could see that the drug was working, but the trial failed because it did not hit the primary endpoint that was identified to the FDA as the one at which they were going to use to measure the drug. We want to avoid that. And the way that we avoid that is with studies like the Resolve study that look at outcome measures, that assess which ones are the most effective at showing change the quickest in the broadest section of the population, that look at disease progression and try to understand how a disease progresses over time, in this case, FSHD. And I think putting together the clinical research network that you all have established and you've grown over time is incredibly important too, because when you take a disease like FSHD that again is slow progressing and variable, when you introduce any kind of noise into that clinical trial, like physical therapists conducting the assessments differently or giving different verbal commands or starting and stopping the stopwatch differently or whatever it is with that specific outcome measure, you start to get differences in results. And that can change the way the assessment of your drug goes. So you want to have a clinical trial research network that is incredibly standardized and sophisticated and well-versed in using the outcome measures that are typically going to be used to measure therapies for your disease, and that have stable, clinical trial staff that are there for the long term. So when we can look at a disease and say, okay, they've got a clinical research network of now, how many of you got in there now, 15, 16 or more? It's a big network and it's international. That is a huge checkbox for us because we can say, okay, there's a group of sites across continents that are going to be able to deliver a trial clinic for us. And that, again, lowers the risk of having the trial itself go off the rails, whether or not the therapy is working. So I would say, to FSHD Society's credit and some of the other organizations in the space, putting together these data studies, capturing the data, making sure it gets published quickly so we can actually point to it, and then putting together the backbone resources like the Clinical Trial Research Network and some of the other data is just incredibly important. And honestly, we couldn't do that work. We can't do it fast enough. It's really great that it started when it did, and that as much as we can get this work out and published sooner than later is just enormously helpful.
Great, thank you. One thing we often try to impress upon our members is almost the first question any drug company asks us when they start looking at the FSHD is there a natural history study? And is there a patient registry? And I think that underscores just how important these studies are. And I think patients often don't, they undervalue them. They kind of think of, oh, it's just an observational study. How does that get us to a treatment? I'm more interested in a clinical trial, et cetera. But this is an essential stepping stone to trial.
Definitely.
Without it, you cannot have a trial.
You can't move forward.
Yep.
You got nothing to point to.
Right. And the U.S. National Registry, I think right now has around 1,000 patients in it. So that's only a few % of the patients in the U.S. who have FSHD. So if you're not in the registry, go sign up. We have just funded Rochester to put an online patient portal for the registry, which they have not had.
Fantastic.
So you will be hearing more about this. We'll definitely be letting everybody know when that online portal comes online, because that will make it much easier and more efficient for everybody to participate in the registry. So we have some questions.
The other thing I would say about the registries is not only do they help capture data that can help us understand the disease better, but if you want to be in a clinical trial, one of the places we're going to go to find potential participants is going to be the registries. So if you're in the registry, that's a huge plus. If you have current contact information in your record in the registry, that's important too. So I would echo everything you said about the registries. They're incredibly important. You want to make sure that you're current in the registry, because I will call Robbie and say, okay, we're ready to start recruiting for this study. Can you send out an email? Mm-hmm. And he will go to his database and he will send it out. So if your email and your contact information is current, you'll hear from us.
Exactly. And it's the same thing. We have our research contact registry at the FSHD Society. And we need your location, because these calls for participation in clinical trials have to be geo-targeted. They have to be in an area where you are close enough to trial center to be able to go make the multiple visits and so on, and allow for the follow-up that's required. So I just can't underscore how important it is to make sure you're signed up, you're in that contact registry. If you have family members who live somewhere else, make sure they're signed up, because they may be near a clinical trial center and you may not be, and you will not get that notification, but your sibling or your child or whoever else who lives somewhere else would get the notification. And I know that a lot of families will have one point of contact and they count on that person to let them know about what's going on. But with the geo-targeting that's required for clinical trials, that won't work. So every individual needs to be represented in the contact registry. So we have a bunch of questions. I think several people have asked if there will be if the dying, FSHD therapeutic goes forward into clinical trial, will it be an international trial, do you think?
So it's highly likely. I mean, there's a lot of things that I can't talk about yet, and I'm really looking forward to the point where we can talk about them. It would be my anticipation that it will be an international trial.
Okay, great. Let's see. I think what everybody knows, and I know you can't say, but is when will clinical trials start? Let's put this another day. What kinds of notifications and news should people be on the lookout to kind of let them know that a clinical trial might be on the
On
way.
its way. Well, as soon as we can start communicating, we will definitely do that. And as I said, we're planning to do quarterly updates. We will work with you and other FSHD organizations to hold webinars, and we'll do quarterly webinars. And we may get on our quarterly webinar and say everything's going really well. We don't have anything to report, but we just want to make sure you guys know that we're still involved, we're still communicating, and we want to let you know where we are. And we're hoping to have other webinars where we can say we are delighted to be able to announce that we will be in the clinic on X date. But what we can promise is that we will be doing quarterly webinars starting next year, and they will closely follow the quarterly earnings announcements that we do, or we'll do at least 3 times a year, so that we just have a sort of a regular cadence of communicating to the community. And we will do that through our partners like FSHD Society. We'll also communicate on our Twitter feed and our Facebook page and LinkedIn, less LinkedIn. But so we will be communicating through our partners and through our own social media channels to make sure that we are reaching out. And then when we get to the point of actually enrolling for the trial, we'll be communicating through the sites as well. So for instance, just to make it up, if one of the sites is the University of Rochester, then we'll obviously be communicating through their list as well. So between the registries, our partners like the FSHD Society, and our own social media, there should be a lot of communication out there to let people know where we are in the development process and when we're ready to go to clinic and launch the trial. And as long as you, as a FSHD community member, are involved in one of those channels, you'll hear from us.
Okay, great. Thank you. There are a couple of questions here related to Resolve. One is a comment from Barbara, who said, when I signed up for the Resolve study, I put online that I know I'm part of the problem, but doing this helped me be part of the solution. I love that. And
congratulations, Barbara.
Yes. And there's another anonymous person who wants to know if there's anything more patients should be doing now that will be helpful to Dine's efforts, whether it's I think Resolve is fully enrolled right now, but I think the MOVE study is a new kind of extension of Resolve. So I guess I can quickly mention that the MOVE study is using the tools that a doctor will normally use in a clinic visit, but doing so in a way that you're tracking that data to see if you can see changes over time, and how those doctor-based measures like a manual muscle test where doctor presses on your arm or your limb to see how much resistance they get and so on, whether those correlate to actual function. So can you climb a stair or not? Well, how does the manual muscle test correlate with that kind of functional outcome? So the MOVE study is recruiting now at the University of Florida in Gainesville, University of Colorado in Denver, the UT Southwest in Dallas, and Stanford Hospital in Palo Alto, as well as Kansas City and Rochester. So if you want to get involved and you live near any of those 6 centers, do contact them and volunteer. And I think they'll also be recruiting from the other clinical trial research network centers within a few months. So that is an answer to the person asking, what more can we do? Let's see. That one's answered. There's a question from someone who is part of the FSHD registry in the United Kingdom. Will these, I think what they really want to know is, will there be a clinical trial in the UK? What are the prospects for that?
So we are looking everywhere, pretty much, in the developed world at potential sites. I know from my colleagues at the FSHD Society that the UK has a very active chapter of very engageable FSHD community members, so that's a huge plus, and that's an exciting thing for us to hear. So, obviously, as I mentioned, there are different criteria that we look at to figure out where to place trials. Is there a really active and engageable population of FSHD patients? Are there study centers that have been involved in FSHD studies that are sophisticated, that are part of a standardized network? Are they overburdened with other studies in other diseases, or are they going to be available for a trial that we might launch, et cetera? So there are different criteria that we look at to pick sites. And it's all obviously with an eye to making sure that what we design is really well positioned to really accurately assess whether the therapy that we bring forward is successful. What we don't want to do is have a potential therapy that doesn't make it through the process because we either cited it in the wrong place, didn't have enough participants, had the wrong endpoints, or didn't have a really solid network of sites. So all of those things will be considered, but certainly the UK will be on the list of potential opportunities, particularly given the major plug we got yesterday from June and Jamshid about what a great population of people that is.
Yes. Great. Here's a question regarding eligibility criteria for clinical trials. So that has been an area that patients were concerned about with previous trials, that they might be restricted. For example, someone who's still ambulatory or who has certain amounts of function. Can you address that, I guess, in a general way, since I think you probably don't know what
yet.
Yes.
Well, we haven't selected any of that yet, right? Because we're still honing in on what our final endpoints will be. But I could say that when you think about inclusion, exclusion criteria and eligibility for a trial, again, what you're trying to do, particularly in a variable, slow progressing disease like FSHD, is understand how to do an assessment in a reasonable amount of time. So you want a patient cohort that is going to be more responsive, because you can't really run a 5-year trial, right? That's just not going to be feasible. So how do you understand what elements of the patient population are going to probably be the earliest to read out potential changes as a result of therapy? And also, how do you avoid any adverse events, AEs, which can shut down a trial? So if you have, for instance, in the first study, the clinical trial for the myotonic dystrophy community, which was through Ionis, one of the earliest inclusion-exclusion criteria was specific cardiac involvement. The good news is, as a result of that study, it became clear that the cardiac concerns that they had that made it a very conservative approach to enrolling people proved to be not that important. And the subsequent DM version of the Resolve study opened up the cardiac inclusion-exclusion criteria quite a bit, because it became clear that it wasn't going to lead to unnecessary adverse events. But when you and the good news is there have been a number of trials in FSHD, and to the extent that we can access that information, we'll know whether there are certain portions of the population that maybe are going to be more susceptible to adverse events in a trial situation, and we'll be able to use some of that information to hopefully have less conservative and less exclusionary inclusion-exclusion criteria. But at the end of the day, what you want is the right cohort of people living with this disease that can show you whether your particular potential therapy is working in a fairly rapid manner, so that you can move it forward if it is working. So it's not so much that that you're trying to exclude people. It's more like you're trying to make sure that you have the right targeted array of people to help you understand that therapy as quickly as possible and as safely as possible.
Right. I think that's a really important point, because I think it's very easy from the patient perspective to feel somehow you're being excluded from an opportunity to try a therapy, even though we don't know if it works or not.
Right.
And I know that's really hard, and especially it feels really, ironic, really, if somebody's very, like in a wheelchair or something, and they feel like they're very impacted and they should have access to something that can help them. But at the end of the day, the trial is a scientific experiment, and you want to design it for success. You have to be very careful about your inclusion criteria and your outcome measures to maximize the chance for success. And it's in everybody's interest to see that happen, because that's how the therapy will get to the clinic faster. If you have a poorly designed trial, poor selection criteria that don't give you that clear answer at the end, it will just slow it down for everybody. So I think
right.
It's a hard lesson.
Exactly. And what we want to do is make sure we design a trial that successfully shows whether our particular potential therapy is working, so that we can get it to people, everybody, as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing to keep in mind, is this is not really let's get everybody on drug. This is let's do a really good job of assessing whether this particular therapy is going to work, so we can get people on drug sooner. It makes me think of something else that I observed when I was in my last job, and that was I appreciate the fact that one of your earlier community members asked about what else can people be doing. So this is a forward-looking what you could be doing. But one of the things that became just a catastrophic problem in Duchenne trials was the fact that people would get on social media and they would start talking to each other about the fact that they were in a trial. And then they would start talking about the experience that they were having in that trial. And what they ended up doing was unblinding the trial. So everybody on the Facebook chat knew who was on drug and who was on placebo, and the trial failed. The trial failed not because the drug wasn't working, not because it wasn't well designed, but because the people participating in the trial unblinded it. That's a huge no-no. So I think being a sophisticated participant when you get to a clinical trial is a really important part of it as well. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot more that we'll talk about when we get closer, but there are things all along the way. There are things that people living with this disease can do and have to do to help us be successful. And it starts from drug design and it goes all the way through.
Thank you. Here's a question. If a drug trial fails because the outcome measures were not correctly chosen, let's say, can it be repeated with better outcome measures?
If there are infinite resources, it can cost $1 billion to develop a therapy and get it to the market. $1 billion is average. That's an enormous amount of money. And if you have a drug that you've gotten through to a phase 2 study or a phase 3 study and it goes down for whatever reason, the chances of that whole approach being revived from the beginning and taken all the way back through the FDA process and everything else is not very good, just because the cost is exorbitant. And it's important to point out that you don't just go through FDA, you go through EMA, you go through NICE in the UK, and you often go country by country to these regulatory bodies, and you have to conduct additional studies in each of these countries to be able to market the drug in each of these countries. So you can't just do a study and have the drug approved across the globe. You have to do a lot of studies, and it just becomes a pretty expensive and complicated. It's an incredibly complicated process to develop a drug for an incredibly complicated disease like FSHD and then get it approved. It's actually a freaking Hail Mary when you do. And it's because we've all worked together really carefully to get this done. But once you've taken a trial through several phases, if the trial goes down for some reason, it's unlikely that it will be revived.
So all this advanced work to make sure the outcome measures are well understood and validated and so on, it makes it just that much more important, because the stakes get really high when you get into clinical trials.
Right.
Yeah. We had a couple of questions related to the mechanism of the antisense oligomers that Dyne is developing. Can you speak a little bit again about how this approach is meant to address or treat FSHD? And related question is it going to stop muscle deterioration or allow muscles to regenerate?
So I just went back to this platform slide really quickly. So again, we've got the FAB, which is basically the delivery. It's the delivery. It's the car. It's also the key. So it gets you to the actual muscle cell wall, and it opens up the muscle cell walls, so you can get the payload in. And then the delivery is this antisense oligonucleotide, which in this case is coming from University of Mons, and it is going to specifically target the DUX4 mutation, and the objective is to turn off the DUX4 expression, and that is the plan. That's the approach. So we're looking to shut down DUX4 expression using these antisense oligonucleotides. What was the second part of your question?
Will this therapy be expected to just
reverse, right?
Reverse, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, our goal with all of these therapies is to stop progression and reverse disease. Whether that's possible and whether that's possible in every single patient, we aren't going to know until we're in patients. You know, there may be people, different diseases, different muscles diseases have different phenotypes. So if you have Duchenne, your muscles replaced by water and fat. You might be able to rescue muscle tissue that's sick, and you might be able to regrow muscle tissue that's sick. You can't turn fat back into muscle. It's not possible. You know, to the extent that you have water replacement, et cetera, in FSHD, it becomes more difficult to reverse actual, you know, regain function because you don't have that muscle anymore. But when you have muscle wasting, where you have muscle shrinkage, and you can rescue that muscle, then you have the opportunity to regain function. So we're going to know more about exactly how much progress we can make in terms of restoring quality of life in FSHD once we get in the clinic and start really working with people that are living with it. But the objective would be to reverse disease.
Great. And that'll probably depend, perhaps to a great extent, on the individual patient and where they are in the disease.
That was kind of my point. Yep.
Yes, right.
I mean, it tends to be true in a lot of these diseases. I mean, many diseases. The earlier you can get to people living with these diseases and start dosing and start treating, the better off your chances of significant change are.
Yeah.
But you know, we will know more hopefully sooner than later.
Right. So once a trial does begin, I mean, I think we have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. How long would each of those phases likely last? What's typical, or what's anticipated, knowing what we do about FSHD?
You know, in general, it really depends. Don't you hate it when people have answers like that? I know I do. It depends on the therapy. It depends on how quickly the therapy is supposed to have effect. It depends on how quickly you can change a particular function or you know, a mutation in a disease. It just really does depend. And you know, for FSHD, for instance, you have losmapimod, which is a small molecule, and you have dyne, which is an antisense oligonucleotide. They're gonna work differently because they're different molecules, and they're delivered differently, they're dosed differently, and they're gonna work differently. So the way that the trial would run for a losmapimod versus a dyne is going to be different. How long it's going to take to see benefit is going to be different. There's a number of things that are just going to be different, and it would be very hard to say a trial would typically last this long and you could expect to see change in this amount of time. I mean, we have a pretty good, we have developed some pretty good modeling, and we have a pretty good idea, but you know, I think the thing to keep in mind with FSHD is it's a slow progressing variable disease. And to the extent that you start to see what you start to see at the cellular level with DUX4 knockdown or myotonic dystrophy, you know, DMPK knockdown or whatever it is, how quickly that leads to functional change, which is what we're going to be looking for, you know, improvements in muscle strength, improvements in mobility, et cetera. That's the part you have to get into the clinic to find out. Mm-hmm. And what you try to do is to model a study that where you believe you can say, we expect to see this kind of functional change in this amount of time with the therapy that we've developed, and that's part of how you think about designing the trial. And then you really hope you're right, because if you cut the trial off too early, then you may have missed the benefit, and you may have missed hitting an endpoint because you didn't go long enough. But at a certain point, you just can't go any longer. So it's not clear how long these different trial phases, I mean, I can't talk about that in specifics. We have some modeling that we've done, and we have some plans in place. I think it would be, I guess you could say it would be hard to find a clinical trial that's a confirmatory study that's lasted more than a couple years, even in a slow progressing disease like FSHD. You're not going to see a 5-year study. So, and that's, so these different phases, I think it's fair to say in muscle diseases like FSHD, you tend to see trials, in the 12-month range.
In the modeling, you've also...
By phase.
Right. Yeah. You also would have come up with kind of a range of numbers of patients you would need at each phase. So
right.
People are asking, how many would you need at each phase?
Right. And again, I can't speak specifically to what we're planning. The considerations are, how many people can you include to be able to wash out any noise? If you have 3 or 4 people that just have an odd genetic modifier or some other characteristic that's going to create dissonance in the trial results, how do you make sure you have enough people in the trial to wash out whatever that noise is? And then how do you do that? How do you design those numbers in such a way that it's not just so exorbitantly expensive? When you're designing something like this FORCE platform, where you have these proprietary antisense oligonucleotides, a very validated valcit linker, and then this proprietary fragmented antibody, and you're manufacturing these in different places around the world, and you're bringing them together and conjugating them, and they have to travel in very specific conditions, for instance, 80 degrees below zero or something like that. When you have these kinds of things, then you're designing something that literally is going to open up a muscle cell wall and get into the actual cell itself, you're developing really expensive therapies. I mean, there's just no way to do these therapies in a way that isn't expensive, because these are incredibly sophisticated gene level technologies. And so we have to manufacture all of that drug, right? And we have to conjugate it, and we have to get it to these different sites. You're not going to develop enough exploratory potential therapy to dose 2,000 people unless you have to, because it's just too expensive. So you're trying to find the balance of the right number of people to participate in these trials in these different sites that will wash out any noise and give you real, solid, accurate results around whether the therapy is working, without loading so many people into the study that the cost of the study becomes exorbitant.
Okay. There's a question here. What's the relationship amongst companies that are working on FSHD therapeutics? I think they're asking about, it's difficult to protect proprietary data, and yet there's some data that, if it were shared, would accelerate knowledge about the disease. So it's a great point. If this was a non-commercial environment and we were all working for the NIH, we could all bring our data and everybody could look at it. And some people's data would be really good, and some people's data would not be that good. Just like, academic lab to academic lab, you have different levels of quality. The same thing is true in companies. And could you potentially accelerate the overall effort? Yes. I mean, the good news is, with respect to FSHD, is you have a number of companies investing in the RESOLVE study, including Dyne. You have advocacy organizations supporting that study. You have a number of different sites around the world supporting that study. And you have a very collaborative, networked program. And that's really what you, especially in the preclinical space, that is exactly the kind of work that you want to see happening. Once you get to the clinic, there's not a whole lot of advantage
to communicating across industry partners or industry members at that point, and it's not going to happen anyway. But by then, you've got very different molecules, you've got very different drug programs, and what one company might be finding out about how that therapy is working in a patient population may or may not have a whole lot of validity for another company that uses a very different therapeutic approach and has different outcome measures and different targets and so forth. So I think, could there be some boost in having industry working more closely together? Yes. And does industry often work together in the preclinical space, particularly when those efforts are organized by organizations like the FSHD Society? Absolutely. And I think there's acknowledgement in industry that those kinds of preclinical partnerships like the Resolve study raise all boats and are incredibly important, and we can't move forward without them. Once you get to the clinic, I think the benefit is far lower, and there's a lot less opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Thanks so much. This is probably the same question asked in a different way, or hypothetically, I can say, if everything went perfectly, when
Yes.
it never does, what, when, in this hypothetical situation, when could this, I guess, come before the FDA for a new drug, approval, and I guess that's the question, what would be
When is that drug going to be available?
Yes.
I know. So what I can tell you is that there will be 3 INDs filed between this quarter of 2020 and the 4th quarter of 2021. So we will be filing 3. And we all know what the 3 lead indications are for DINE. They are FSHD, DM1, and Duchenne. It is typically the case that within a month to several months after you file an IND or an investigational new drug application with the FDA, you are in clinic. So we know these things to be true, right? Then once you're in clinic, you're going through phase 1, you're going through phase 2, you're going through phase 3, unless there are certain events or opportunities with the regulatory pathway that can abbreviate that path. That's typically how it goes. And depending on how long each of those phases is, you're hoping to get to the FDA or the EMA or any of these other regulatory bodies with conclusive results of a confirmatory study or a final study, phase 3 study, within some number of months. So depending on the length of each of the phases, it could be a couple of years, it just depends.
Right.
Unfortunately. And I think, your community has watched the Acceleron trial. They're currently involved in and observing the Fulcrum trial. You get a sense for how long each of these phases can go, and then what happens once the phase closes and the data is analyzed and people are ready to take the data that they've learned from that phase and move to the next phase, et cetera, or not. So, I mean, you can get a sense for how these things typically roll. It takes a few years.
Okay. We have a comment or question from a member in Brazil saying, would it be possible to think about conducting a clinical trial in Brazil in conjunction, obviously, with a clinical trial center there? He said, we have hundreds of people affected by FSHD in the Brazil registry. So what would it take for a country that's new to the clinical trial scene for FSHD, obviously not for other diseases? What would a company look for, I guess, for clinical trial sites beyond off the beaten track, as it were?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of things that you take into consideration. We talked about a few of them, whether there's an active participatory, organized population of people living with the disease, which it sounds like there is in Brazil, whether there is a clinical trial site that has experience working with muscle diseases, that has a primary investigator or principal investigator that understands FSHD, ideally has even published in FSHD or is a very active clinician in FSHD, whether he or she has a clinical staff that's experienced in clinical trials like CRC or a PT, or all of those clinical staff. That's the kind of backbone that you need in a site to deliver a trial successfully. And the last thing you want is to have a site that can't deliver, that collects data inaccurately, that reports data inaccurately, that doesn't measure the assessments correctly, and that creates a bunch of noise in the trial that can make the whole trial fail. So if we're looking at sites, we're thinking about, we're looking at capacity. We're looking at the capacity of the principal investigator. We're looking at the capacity of the clinical staff. We're looking at the capacity of the population of people living with the disease, and other considerations as well. But it really is what we want to do here, and what I think everybody on this webinar wants to do, is make sure that we have a really smart trial design and a really smart trial process. So if we do have a therapy that is going to be transformative for patients, it makes it all the way through. And that's what will be first and foremost what leads back. Now, if there's a site in Brazil that meets those criteria, we'd be super excited to go to Brazil for all kinds of reasons. We like Brazil. It's just going to boil down to how can we run the best possible trial.
Great, thank you so much. Maybe this might be the last question we have time for. The therapy that Dyne is developing, would it be a single treatment, one and done, or is it something that would require multiple dosing over a lifetime, let's say?
Yeah, so this would be an ongoing ongoing dosing regimen. This would not be a one and done gene editing effort.
Great, thank you so much. Well, thank you very, very much for joining us today and sharing so much information and carrying on this really interesting conversation with our community. So I just have a few quick announcements. We have an all California virtual chapter meeting this Saturday. And everyone, you don't have to be in California to join because it's virtual. It's going to focus on traveling by wheelchair. And I think it'll be just a great gathering and opportunity. So we encourage you to tune in if you can. Next Wednesday, the 21st, we have FSHD Society Radio with Bill and Mitch, our fitness gurus. It's always a very popular one. And next month, November 19th, is our next FSHD University webinar. This one is with Russell Butterfield from the University of Utah. He will be talking about a fascinating big family study involving this famous Utah pedigree that has FSHD, and they've tracked down thousands of family members, and they're looking for more. So it's one of the most interesting science stories in FSHD, plus it's active, ongoing, and they're looking for people who might be part of this family, and who knows, some of you might be, and you don't know it right now. So join us a month from now to hear about the Utah study. Well, that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, and thank you especially Molly White for being with us today.
Thanks, everybody. We'll talk soon.
Bye.